Hey there! Have you ever wondered why the United States is the world's superpower? Most people might say it's because of their strong military, advanced technology, or nuclear weapons. And yeah, those things are definitely a big deal. But here's a little secret. The US has another powerful weapon that might even be stronger than nukes. It's a system called the petrodollar. You might have seen news recently about BRICS countries teaming up to challenge the petrodollar or starting the de-dollarization. But what does that even mean? What is the petrodollar? Why does it make the US so powerful? And why is it so controversial? So this video will explain all you need to know about the petrodollar. Section 1. What is the petrodollar? The word petrodollar comes from petro, which means petrol or oil, and dollar referring to the US dollar currency. There's also a term called petroyuan, which works the similar way but uses the Chinese yuan instead. But for now, we'll focus on the US dollar. So the petrodollar is a system where oil is traded exclusively using the US dollar around the world. In other words, no matter which country is buying or selling the oil, they will always do it using the US dollar. And just to clarify, the petrodollar isn't a different type of currency, it's a system. So how does this petrodollar work? Let's break it down. Step 1. A country rich in oil, like Saudi Arabia, sells its oil to other countries using the US dollar, not its own currency, which is the Saudi Riyal. So this is called petrodollar. Then, step 2. After Saudi Arabia gets those US dollars, it doesn't just keep them in the bank or use it for themselves. Instead, they will reinvest those US dollars back to the US treasuries, bonds, and other US assets. As you know, when you buy bonds and treasuries, you are lending your money to the government, and the government will repay you the money back plus the interest. In this case, when Saudi Arabia buys US bonds and treasuries, it means Saudi Arabia lent their money to the US government, which makes the US get easy money, but of course, in return, the US will pay Saudi Arabia the interest of the bond and treasuries. This is called petrodollar recycling. But why recycling? Because every time oil is sold, the US dollars earned by oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia flow back to the US economy through investments. When other countries are competing, negotiating so hard to get loan from other richer countries or institutions like the IMF. But for the US, thanks to the petrodollar system, each time oil is sold, the loans will just keep flowing in automatically. And not only that, bonds' interest rates are generally lower than the interest rates from other countries' loan, or IMF. So US not only getting automatic, but also cheap loan. But you're wondering why the US made this system? How can the US impose this system? And how has an oil-rich country like Saudi Arabia agreed on this? Well, we'll talk about it in the next section. Section 2. History of the petrodollar. To understand how the petrodollar system came to be, we need to understand first the history of the petrodollar. Before 1944, all currencies were tied to gold, a system called the gold standard. This meant that to print money, a country had to first acquire gold. If there was no gold, they could not print money. But during World War II, most countries, especially in Europe, drained their gold reserves during the war and had no gold left to back their currencies. At that time, the US already had 70% of the world's supply of gold. So in 1944, about 44 countries agreed to tie their currencies to the US dollar, and the US dollar would be tied to the US gold reserve. This system was called the Bretton Woods system. This made the US dollar as global currency, but it was still tied to gold. This meant that to print more US dollars, the US needed more gold, which wasn't easy. At the same time, the US was spending heavily on the Vietnam War, the Cold War, and other big spendings, so it needed tons of money, but couldn't keep up with the gold standard. So in 1971, the US president at that time, Richard Nixon, just decided to make the US dollar not tied to gold anymore, which is called the Nixon shock. Due to this, the value of the US dollar became more unstable, and leaving the US looking for a way to maintain the US dollar's global dominance. Actually, you can watch more about this in my other video about fiat money. Well, yeah, it's kind of related. Link in the description. Now, let's move to Saudi Arabia in 1973. At that time, the Middle East was politically unstable, like the Yom Kippur War, a war between Israel versus the coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria. During this war, Saudi Arabia and most Arab oil-rich countries supported Egypt and Syria, while the US and the West backed Israel. In response, Saudi Arabia led an oil embargo against the West, causing an energy crisis with skyrocketing prices. But while the West struggled, the embargo also hurt Saudi Arabia's economy, as less oil sold meant less revenue. On top of that, Saudi Arabia still relied on US technology and global markets. Realizing that the embargo was harming both sides, the US and Saudi Arabia reached an informal and secret agreement in 1974, commonly called the Petrodollar Agreement. Since the deal was secret, there's no official government statement about it. The agreement was simple. The US promised military protection and support for Saudi Arabia, and in return, Saudi Arabia must sell its oil only in US dollar. Yeah, only in US dollar, not in their own currency, which is Saudi Riyal. And not only that, Saudi Arabia also needs to reinvest those US dollars from oil revenue back into US treasuries, bonds, and stocks. Simply said, when you buy government bonds, it means you lend money to the government. So when Saudi Arabia bought US bonds, Saudi Arabia lent their money to the US, and this is called petrodollar recycling. Why is this important? Well, by investing these dollars back into the US, Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing nations were lending billions of dollars from oil revenue to the US. The US government would get those billions of dollars, which helped the US to invest heavily on their economy and military. With so many easy loans, the US was not only able to maintain a strong military presence in the Middle East, but it also secured a steady flow of capital into its financial markets. This helped the US keep the dollar as the world's dominant currency. Once Saudi Arabia agreed, other oil-rich countries also followed the same things. Because at that time, only the US was seen capable in both technology and military to support and protect them. So by investing their petrodollars in US assets, that their wealth was safe and growing, as at that time, the US economy was the biggest and fastest growing. So in short, the US used the petrodollar system to secure the strength of its dollar and its global influence, while oil exporting countries, especially Saudi Arabia, secured military protection and economic stability. Now, your next question is, how did the petrodollar help the US become the world's superpower? Well, we'll talk about it in the next section. Section 3. How important is the petrodollar to the US? As previously mentioned, before the petrodollar even existed, the US dollar was already the world's most in-demand currency, and the petrodollar system only made the US dollar even more in demand. Why? Well, you might need oil in your daily life, from petrol, for your transportations, energy, factories, and much more. Simply put, all countries need oil, and if they want to buy oil from an oil-rich country like Saudi Arabia, they need US dollars. This made the US dollar even more in demand, since all countries needed to buy oil, and the US is the only country that can print it, and that's why the US has big influence on oil trade and price around the world. And that's why if a country has oil, the US seems very interested in them. The petrodollar recycle system also requires all these oil-rich countries to lend their oil money to the US. This gave the US so much money to build its military and economy, allowing it to remain the world's strongest country, at least for now. Lastly, the US can actually weaponize the petrodollar. By sanctioning countries that don't obey the US, it maintains global influence. How does this work? Well, we'll talk about it in the next section. Section 4. Why is the petrodollar controversial? After understanding the petrodollar, you might say that this system seems quite controversial, which actually it is. The first controversy is global dependency on the US dollar. Oil importing countries must save lots of US dollars to buy oil, making them vulnerable to changes in the dollar's value. Imagine a country saving so many US dollars, only to find their value weakening. And that's why US elections, Federal Reserve rates changes, and US any economic and political conditions are monitored closely by people around the world. The second controversy is US control over global trade. Since oil exporting countries reinvest their petrodollars into US assets, their economies become financially tied to the US. If the US economy struggles, the value of their investments drops too. On top of that, most global oil trade buys and sells oil in USD, which need to pass through US regulated banks. If your country is on Uncle Sam's naughty list, the US can impose sanctions, making it harder for your country to send or receive US dollars. Well, if you want me to explain more about sanctions, please let me know in the comment section. Surprisingly, the petrodollar has one disadvantage for the US. Funny, right? The petrodollar system makes the US need to run trade deficits to maintain US dollar liquidity. Here's why. When the US exports goods to other countries, it sells products, and other countries pay in US dollars. But when the US imports goods, it buys products and pays US dollars to other countries. For the petrodollar system to work, the US must import more than it exports, meaning it has to send more US dollars out into the world. This keeps the US dollar circulating globally, making it easy for other countries to use, especially for buying oil. This is great for countries that need US dollars for trade. But for the US, it means running a trade deficit because it buys more than it sells. Even though petrodollar recycling helps by giving the US automatic loans from oil sales to cover the deficit, it also explains why the US has tons of debt. Ahem. On the other side, if the US exports more than it imports, more countries would be paying US dollars back to the US, meaning fewer US dollars circulating outside the country. This would make it harder for other nations to get US dollars for global trade, especially for buying oil. If that happens, countries might start looking for alternative currencies instead of the US dollar, which will weaken the US dollar influence and domination. So the petrodollar comes with a cost for the US. But it seems like the US accepts this as the price for maintaining its influence in the global economy and politics. The more demand there is for US dollars, the more power the US has. Now, you might be curious about the future of the petrodollar. Well, we'll talk about that in our next section. Section 5. Future of the petrodollar. Now, you might be wondering, will the petrodollar stay forever? Well, the petrodollar sure does have some challenges now. First is challenges from other countries. Recently, BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and others, have planned to trade oil using their own currencies instead of the US dollar. For example, Saudi Arabia has discussed selling oil to China in Saudi riyals and Chinese yuan instead of US dollars, a system called the petroyuan. As of 2025, Saudi Arabia and other oil-rich countries still use the petrodollar. Yeah, the petroyuan is still in talk. However, countries like Russia and Iran have started selling their oil in other currencies, such as the Chinese yuan and the euro. So if this trend continues or succeeds, it could challenge the petrodollar. The second challenge is declining oil reliance. As the world moves toward renewable energy sources like solar and wind power, the demand for oil might decrease. With less oil consumption, the need for the petrodollar could shrink, making the US less able to use its dollar dominance to maintain global influence. Even though the world still needs oil and green alternatives are still hard to fully replace it as of 2025, nobody knows what will happen in the future. Even if the petrodollar were abandoned today, the US would likely remain a global superpower. That's because the US dollar isn't just supported by the petrodollar. It's already deeply integrated into the global economy. However, losing the petrodollar would mean losing a key tool of influence, forcing the US to adapt to maintain its dominance. So if there's oil, well, you know who's knocking at the door.
Knock, knock, motherfucker. It's the United States of America, and I hear you guys got oil that isn't under my possession. So turn off the stove and return the oil to me before I have to resort to bringing democracy.
If you want me to make other videos like this, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.